do not look behind you. In Eldermurk, the shadows don't follow your movements, they anticipate them. If you hear your own name whispered from the hollow of a dead tree, keep walking. To acknowledge the mist is to invite it in, and once Eldermurk enters your lungs, your soul no longer belongs to you. You are about to enter a realm where time is measured in heartbeats of fear, and the only law is the silence of the grave. Brace yourself, for the fog is rising, and it has been waiting a very long time for someone like you. The mists of Eldermurk do not merely drift, they breathe. They carry the scent of damp earth, ancient pine, and something far older, the metallic tang of a secret kept too long. In this corner of the world, the sun is a distant myth, a pale ghost that occasionally glimmers behind a shroud of perpetual gray. Here, the shadows have weight, and the silence is never truly empty. It is a place where the trees grow twisted, their gnarled limbs reaching out like the fingers of a drowning man, and the wind whispers names that have been forgotten by the rest of humanity. Elias Thorne stood at the edge of the Blackwood Verge, his lantern flickering against the encroaching gloom. He was a man who dealt in relics, things pulled from the mud that should have stayed buried. But the object heavy in his pocket today was different. It didn't hum with power, it throbbed with a rhythmic, low-frequency pulse that felt uncomfortably like a heartbeat. It was a silver compass. Its needle spun not toward the north, but toward the deepest, darkest hollow of the forest where the mists were thickest. He took a step forward, the dry needles crunching under his boots. The sound seemed unnaturally loud, echoing through the cathedral of trees. Eldermurk was listening. It always was. As he ventured deeper, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, thick enough to taste. The compass in his pocket grew warmer. Elias knew the legends. They spoke of the Hollow King, a figure woven from shadow and spite who ruled the sunless depths. They spoke of the Iron Gate, a threshold that separated the waking world from a nightmare that refused to end. Elias didn't believe in fairy tales, but as a low, mournful howl rose from the distance. Not a wolf, but something with a voice far too human. His grip on the lantern tightened until his knuckles turned white. The path ahead began to dissolve into a labyrinth of gray roots and shifting fog. The light of his lantern struggled to penetrate more than a few feet, illuminating only the grotesque shapes of the flora that thrived in this sunless rot. Fungi, pale and bioluminescent, clung to the bark of the trees like glowing ulcers. They pulsed in sync with the compass in his pocket. Elias stopped. Ahead of him, partially obscured by a veil of weeping willow branches, stood a structure that defied logic. A spire of obsidian, jagged and slick as if it had just emerged from a dark sea, pierced the canopy. It didn't belong here. It didn't belong anywhere. As he approached, the compass began to scream, a high-pitched metallic whine that set his teeth on edge. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling, to touch the stone. Just as his skin brushed the cold surface, the forest went deathly silent. The wind died. The howling stopped. And then, from the other side of the obsidian wall, came a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of a fingernail against stone. Elias froze. He wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of the flickering tavern lights at the village edge, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The obsidian began to ripple like water. A face, distorted, elongated, and devoid of eyes, pressed against the translucent surface from the inside, staring through him into the soul of Eldermurk itself. "You've brought it back," a voice whispered, not into his ears, but directly into the marrow of his bones. "The heart of the king. The key to the cage." Elias reached for the compass, but his hand felt like lead. The pulse from the silver object was now so violent he could see his coat sleeve twitching. The ground beneath him began to tremble. The roots of the ancient trees started to coil and writhe, pulling themselves from the earth like giant, waking serpents. The obsidian spire groaned, a sound of grinding tectonic plates. Fissures of violet light began to spiderweb across its surface. Elias realized too late that he wasn't a relic hunter today. He was a delivery boy for a catastrophe. The mist suddenly surged, swallowing the lantern's light, swallowing the trees, swallowing everything but the jagged black stone and the eyeless face within. He was alone in the void of Eldermurk, and the door was finally beginning to swing open. The violet light fractured the obsidian spire like a dying star, casting jagged, rhythmic shadows that danced across Elias's pale face. The silence of Eldermurk had been replaced by a low, vibrating hum, a sound that didn't just fill the air but seemed to rewrite the very chemistry of the forest. Elias clutched the silver compass as it burned through his leather glove. The object was no longer a tool. It was an anchor, dragging him toward a threshold he had spent his entire life avoiding. The face behind the rippling stone began to pull back, retreating into the velvet darkness within the spire. As it faded, the stone itself didn't just crack. It began to peel away in long, crystalline shards that dissolved into ash before hitting the ground. The mist surged forward, drawn toward the opening like water into a vacuum. Elias felt the gravitational pull of the void. His boots slid across the slick, needle-strewn earth, leaving deep furrows in the rot as he fought to stay upright. "Wait!" he choked out, his voice sounding thin and brittle against the roar of the encroaching vacuum. But there was no one to hear him. Not the villagers who feared the fog, and certainly not the shadows that now stood upright among the trees. Around the clearing, the twisted oaks began to bleed. A thick, obsidian sap oozed from the fissures in their bark, pooling at the roots and forming mirrors that reflected a sky Eldermurk had never seen. A sky filled with a cold, uncaring void and stars that blinked like dying eyes. Elias watched in horror as his own reflection in one of these pools began to move independently. His reflection didn't look scared, it looked hungry. It reached out a hand from the liquid dark, its fingers elongated and tipped with the same jagged stone that formed the spire. He tore his gaze away, stumbling back into the maw of the spire, just as the forest behind him erupted into a cacophony of snapping timber. The trees were closing in, their limbs intertwining to form a cage of thorns and jagged bark. The only way out was through. As Elias stepped across the threshold of the obsidian structure, the temperature plummeted. This wasn't the cold of winter. It was the cold of a place where heat had never been permitted to exist. The interior was vast, far larger than the exterior dimensions suggested. It was a cathedral of hollowed stone and suspended gravity. Vast chains, forged from a metal that seemed to absorb the meager light of his dying lantern, stretched from the floor into an infinite ceiling of swirling fog. At the center of the hall stood an altar made of bone, not human bone, but the massive, ivory-like remains of something prehistoric and terrifying. Resting upon it was a crown of iron thorns, dripping with the same black sap he had seen on the trees outside. The silver compass in his hand suddenly went cold. The needle stopped spinning. It pointed directly at the crown. "The heart seeks the head," the eyeless voice whispered again, now echoing from every corner of the vast hall. "The king has been headless for an age, Thorne. The mists are but his breath, looking for a throat to call home." Elias looked at the compass. The silver casing was beginning to melt, the liquid metal dripping onto his fingers, yet it didn't burn. It felt like mercury-infused ice. He realized then that the compass wasn't a relic he had found. It was a piece of the king that had been calling to its master. He had been lured into the Blackwood Verge not by chance, but by the gravitational pull of an ancient debt. He approached the altar, his breath hitching in his chest. Each step felt like walking through waist-deep water. The air was thick with the static of 1,000 unspoken curses. As he reached the bone altar, the iron crown began to levitate, the thorns twitching like the legs of an upturned insect. Suddenly, the chains around the room began to rattle. Something massive was shifting in the darkness above. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards of the obsidian hall, a sound of immense hunger and ancient boredom. Elias looked up and saw eyes, thousands of them, tiny and crimson, opening along the lengths of the iron chains. They weren't animals. They were the eyes of everyone who had ever wandered into Eldermurk and never wandered out. The crown hovered inches from his face. He could see the intricate carvings on the iron, depictions of cities falling into the sea, of forests consuming kings, of a world where light was a sin punished by eternal darkness. The crown wanted him. Or rather, it wanted the vessel he provided. "Take it," the voice urged, now sounding like a choir of 1,000 mourning mothers. "Put an end to the mist. Put an end to the searching. Become the anchor Eldermurk requires." Elias reached out. His fingers hovered near the iron thorns. He could feel the power radiating from it, a promise of absolute control over the fog, the ability to command the shadows, to never be afraid of the dark again. But as his hand moved closer, he noticed something he had missed. Beneath the altar, half buried in the shifting obsidian dust, were hundreds of silver compasses, all identical to his own. Some were tarnished by centuries, others looked as fresh as the one in his pocket. He wasn't the first delivery boy. He was simply the latest. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The king didn't want a heart. He wanted a succession of souls to feed the machine that kept Eldermurk alive. The crown wasn't a prize, it was a leash. He tried to pull his hand back, but the mercury-like liquid from the compass had already bonded his skin to the bone altar. The iron thorns lunged forward, the crown expanding to fit his brow. Elias screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the sudden chime of a distant, dissonant bell. The obsidian hall began to tilt. The gravity failed completely, sending him and the shards of his lantern drifting into the eye-filled darkness of the ceiling. The mist flooded the chamber, turning the world into a blur of gray and violet. As he drifted, he saw the face again. It wasn't behind stone this time. It was drifting alongside him, its featureless surface inches from his own. "The transition is always the hardest part," it whispered, its voice now sounding exactly like Elias's own. "But don't worry. In Eldermurk, you're never truly gone. You just become part of the atmosphere." The iron thorns pierced his temples, but there was no blood, only a pouring out of gray smoke. His memories, the smell of baked bread, the sound of a river in summer, the face of a woman he once loved, began to leak out of the wounds, dissolving into the fog. He felt himself thinning, his bones turning to ash, his skin becoming translucent. But just as the last of his humanity began to fray, Elias felt a spark of something the mist couldn't consume: spite. He reached out with his dissolving hand and grabbed the crown, not to wear it, but to crush it. The spire shrieked. The eyes on the chains blinked in unison, a flash of red that blinded the world. The descent began. Not a fall through space, but a fall through the very fabric of reality, back toward the roots of the world where the first shadow was cast. Eldermurk was not finished with him, and the real journey into the sunless depths had only just begun. The descent felt like being shredded by 1,000 invisible blades. Elias was no longer falling through air, but through the compressed memories of the forest itself. He saw flashes of Eldermurk before the fog, a land of golden wheat and vibrant rivers, now long since devoured by the obsidian rot. The spite that had fueled his resistance was the only thing keeping his consciousness from shattering into 1,000,000 gray atoms. As the crushing pressure of the transition finally subsided, Elias hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud. But it wasn't earth beneath him. It was soft, yielding, and smelled of ancient parchment. He opened his eyes to find himself in a place the villagers only spoke of in hushed, terrified whispers: the Ossuary of Echoes. This was the subterranean root of Eldermurk, a sprawling cavern of impossible dimensions. Above him, the ceiling, was a tangled web of colossal, glowing tree roots that pulsed with a rhythmic, sickly violet light. They looked like the veins of a titan, pumping the essence of the world above down into this dark womb. Below the roots, the floor was covered in miles of discarded books, scrolls, and loose pages, the literal recorded history of every soul the mist had ever consumed. Elias pushed himself up, his hands trembling. Where his skin had been pierced by the iron crown, there were no scars, only faint, glowing runes that hummed beneath his flesh. He was marked. He was a part of the ledger now. The air here was stagnant, heavy with the dust of a billion forgotten words. As he took his first step, the papers beneath his boots rustled, and a chorus of whispers rose from the floor. Each page contained a fragment of a life, a grocery list from a woman in the 14th century, a soldier's last letter, a child's drawing of a sun that no longer shone. They weren't just records, they were the husks of identities. "You are walking on the only truth that remains," a voice echoed. It wasn't the eyeless face from the spire. This voice was old, brittle, like the cracking of dry leather. From behind a pillar of calcified scrolls, a figure emerged. It was draped in robes made of stitched-together parchment, its face hidden behind a mask carved from a stag's skull. The figure carried a staff tipped with a silver compass identical to the one Elias had lost, but this one was shattered, its needle frozen. "The Chronicler," Elias whispered, the name surfacing from some deep, instinctual part of his mind. The Chronicler, the jailer, the librarian of the lost. "Names are just anchors for things that refuse to float," the figure said, moving with a jerky, unnatural grace. "You survived the crowning. A rare feat. Most simply dissolve into the ink. But you have the mark of the unwritten." Elias looked at the glowing runes on his arms. "I didn't ask for this. I wanted to find the heart of the mist to stop it." The chronicler let out a sound that might have been a laugh, or perhaps just the rattling of dry leaves. "To stop the mist is to stop the world from breathing. Eldermurk isn't a curse, Thorne. It's an archive. It collects. It preserves. It ensures that nothing is ever truly lost, even if it is never truly found again." The chronicler gestured to the vast cavern. "Every step you take destroys 1,000 memories and awakens 1,000 more. Tell me, do you feel the weight of them? The sudden urge to weep for a mother you never had? To fear a war that ended 1,000 years ago? That is the ossuary at work. It is merging you with the collection." Elias felt it, a sudden, sharp pang of grief for a home he had never seen, a cottage by a sea he didn't recognize. He shook his head violently, trying to clear the mental fog. "I'm not staying here. There must be a way back up. The spire, the gate." "The gate only swings one way for the living," the chronicler said, stepping closer. The stag mask tilted curiously. "But you aren't entirely living anymore, are you? The Iron Crown saw to that. You are a bridge now. A bridge between the silence above and the screams below." The chronicler held out the staff. The shattered compass began to glow with a pale, ghostly light. "If you wish to leave, you must go deeper, to the core of the root. There, the Hollow King waits, not as a ghost, but as a vacancy. A hole in the world that needs to be filled." As the chronicler spoke, the glowing roots above began to descend, their tips sharpening into needles. The ossuary was reacting to Elias's presence, sensing a rogue element that refused to be filed away. The papers at his feet began to swirl, whipped up by a sudden, freezing wind. They formed a cyclone of jagged edges, each page a razor-sharp memory capable of flaying the soul from the bone. "Run, unwritten one," the chronicler hissed. "Run before the ink claims you. Follow the light of the shattered needle. It will lead you to the king's throne, but beware, the throne is never empty for long." Elias didn't wait. He sprinted across the shifting sea of parchment, his boots tearing through the history of humanity. Behind him, the paper cyclone grew, a towering monolith of lost words that shrieked with the voices of a million ghosts. The violet roots lashed out like whips, striking the ground with the force of lightning. He scrambled over mounds of ancient tomes, the glow of the runes on his arms intensifying as he drew closer to the cavern's exit, a narrow fissure that bled a darkness so pure it made the surrounding gloom look like high noon. As he reached the fissure, he risked a look back. The chronicler was gone, replaced by a wall of swirling paper and thrashing roots. But in the center of the storm, he saw a shape, a tall, skeletal figure wearing the iron crown he had tried to destroy. It wasn't him, not yet. But the figure waved, a slow, mocking gesture of farewell. Elias dived into the fissure. The transition this time was silent. He felt himself stretching, his body becoming a long, thin line of ink drawn across the canvas of the void. He was no longer Elias Thorne, the relic hunter. He was a story being written by a hand that had no pulse. He emerged into a space of absolute stillness. No wind, no whispers, no violet light. Just a single, narrow bridge of white bone stretching across a bottomless chasm. At the end of the bridge sat a throne made of mirrors. And sitting upon that throne was a version of himself, older, withered, and eyes leaking the gray mist of Eldermurk. The figure on the throne looked up, a thin, cruel smile touching its lips. "You're late," it said. "I've been holding my breath for an eternity." The finality of the situation settled over Elias like a shroud. This wasn't a journey of escape, it was a cycle of replacement. Every shadow in Eldermurk was a former version of the man on the throne, and every mist-shrouded tree was a memory that had grown too heavy to carry. He stepped onto the bridge of bone. Each footfall echoed with the sound of a closing door. The runes on his skin began to bleed into the bone beneath his feet, anchoring him to the bridge, drawing him toward the mirror throne. The air began to pulse again, that same rhythmic, low-frequency heartbeat he had felt in the silver compass. But now, it was coming from his own chest. He wasn't carrying the heart of the king anymore. He was becoming it. The bone bridge groaned under the weight of Elias's footsteps, a hollow, resonant sound that felt like teeth grinding in the dark. Below him, the chasm was an ocean of pure, unmanifested shadow, a place where gravity went to die. At the far end, the figure on the mirror throne remained motionless, its eyes, those swirling whirlpools of gray mist, locked onto his every movement. "Who are you?" Elias asked, his voice now carrying an echo that sounded like several people speaking at once. The man on the throne didn't move his lips, yet the answer vibrated through the bone bridge. "I am the conclusion. I am the Elias who decided that the burden of being human was too heavy. I am the part of you that wants to stop running." As Elias drew closer, the mirrors that made up the throne began to shift. They didn't reflect the cavern, they reflected different versions of Elias's life. In one shard, he was still a child, playing in a sun-drenched field. In another, he was an old man, dying peacefully in a bed that smelled of lavender. In a third, he was a monster, his skin replaced by obsidian scales, roaming the blackwood verge. "These are not memories," the figure whispered. "These are the debts you owe to reality. Eldermurk is the collector. It allowed you to exist in the world above, and now, it requires the payment of your essence." Elias stopped a few paces from the throne. The runes on his arms were now glowing so brightly they began to sear his flesh, the light a harsh, jagged violet. He realized that the throne wasn't just a seat, it was a prism. It took the light of a soul and refracted it into the mist that fueled the entire forest above. The chronicler said, "I was the unwritten," Elias challenged, his voice gaining strength from the very spite that had saved him before. "If I am unwritten, then my ending hasn't been decided. You are just a ghost of a path I haven't taken yet." The figure on the throne laughed, a dry, rattling sound that caused the mirrors to crack. "Logic is a fragile shield in the deep dark, Thorne. Look at your hands." Elias looked. His fingers were beginning to turn into ink, dark, fluid, and shimmering with an iridescent sheen. The ink was flowing upward, merging with the runes. He wasn't just being written, he was being used as the very medium for the story. Suddenly, the mirrors of the throne shattered outward. The shards didn't fall, they hovered in the air like a cloud of silver locusts. Each shard hummed with a different frequency, a discordant symphony of 1,000 possible lives. The figure on the throne dissolved into a cloud of gray smoke, leaving the seat empty and inviting. "Sit," the voices of the shards commanded in unison. "Sit and find peace. Sit and become the eye of the storm." But Elias saw the trap. The empty throne was the hunger of Eldermurk personified. It needed a conscious mind to process the stolen memories of the world, to act as a processor for the archive. If he sat, he would become the king, but he would also become a prisoner, his mind shattered across the 1,000,000 pages of the Ossuary of Echoes. Instead of sitting, Elias turned toward the chasm. "If the story is written in ink," he muttered, "then it can be smudged." He plunged his ink-stained hands into the bone of the bridge. The runes on his skin flared with a blinding intensity, and for the first time, the silence of the deep cavern was broken by a sound that wasn't a whisper or a groan. It was a scream of pure, mechanical agony. The bone bridge began to dissolve into liquid marrow, and the runes on Elias's arms acted as a conduit, siphoning the energy of the deep root directly into his own dissolving form. He wasn't fighting the mist anymore, he was consuming it. The cavern erupted. The giant, glowing roots above began to lash down like the tentacles of an angry god. The violet light turned a deep, angry crimson. The unwritten mark on his arm wasn't a badge of honor, it was a flaw in the system, a virus in the archive. The paper cyclone from the ossuary above began to pour through the fissure, a literal waterfall of lost history attempting to bury the rogue element. Elias stood his ground, his body now a swirling vortex of ink and violet light. He felt the weight of every grocery list, every last letter, and every child's drawing. He felt the grief of the woman from the 14th century and the fear of the soldier. He didn't reject them. He took them in. He became the archive. As the sheer volume of information threatened to erase his mind, a new path appeared. It wasn't a bridge, and it wasn't a gate. It was a crack in the very fabric of the gray void, a sliver of something that wasn't gray, wasn't violet, and wasn't obsidian. It was the color of a real sun. But between him and that light stood the chronicler, the stag-masked figure now 10 feet tall, its robes of parchment fluttering like the wings of a dying moth. "You would burn the library to save a single page," the chronicler thundered, the staff of the shattered compass raised high. "You are nothing but a footnote, Thorne. You do not have the right to end the collection." "I am the footnote that changes the meaning of the sentence," Elias replied, his voice now a roar that shook the foundations of Eldermurk. He lunged forward, not with a weapon, but with the raw power of the unwritten. The ink of his body collided with the parchment of the chronicler, and the resulting explosion of light and shadow tore the mirrors of the throne into dust. The world went white. When the light faded, Elias wasn't in the cavern, and he wasn't in the spire. He was standing in a part of the forest he didn't recognize. The trees here weren't twisted. They were straight and tall, though their leaves were the color of tarnished silver. The mist was gone, replaced by a soft, ethereal glow that seemed to come from the ground itself. He looked at his hands. They were solid again, but the skin was pale, almost translucent, and the violet runes remained, pulsing faintly like a second heartbeat. He had escaped the deep root, but he had brought a piece of the king back with him. Ahead of him, the silver trees parted to reveal a village. But it wasn't his village. The houses were made of white stone, and the people walking the streets moved with a slow, rhythmic grace. They didn't look like the terrified peasants of the verge. They looked like statues brought to life. As he walked toward the village, he realized the terrifying truth. He hadn't escaped Eldermurk. He had simply moved into a deeper layer, the layer where the mist preserved the things it loved. This was the ideal Eldermurk, a beautiful, static nightmare where nothing ever changed, nothing ever grew, and nothing ever died. And at the center of the village square, a fountain was carved in his likeness, holding a silver compass that pointed directly at his heart. The white stone houses of the silver village gleamed with a light that had no source. There were no shadows here, only a soft, pervasive luminescence that felt like being trapped inside a pearl. The villagers Elias saw, men, women, and children, were flawless. Their skin was smooth as polished marble, their eyes a uniform, calm gray. They did not speak. They hummed. A low, collective vibration that harmonized with the silver leaves of the trees. As Elias walked through the square, the villagers stopped. Their heads tilted in perfect synchronization, like a flock of birds catching a scent. They weren't looking at him. They were looking at the violet runes on his arms. To them, he was a stain on a perfect canvas. "You smell of the ink," a woman said, stepping forward. She was beautiful in a way that made Elias's stomach churn, too symmetrical, too still. "You smell of the struggle and the rot. Why have you brought the friction of the lower world into the stillness of the silver layer?" "I'm looking for the way out," Elias said, his voice sounding jagged and harsh against the velvet humming of the air. "I'm looking for a world that bleeds and changes. This is a cemetery of statues." The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Change is the mother of loss, Elias Thorne. Here, we have defeated loss. We are the memories that the king deemed too precious to let fade. We are the peak of every life, held forever in the moment before the decline." She reached out to touch his arm, but as her fingers drew near the violet runes, she recoiled. A hiss of steam rose from her hand, and for a split second, the marble facade of her skin cracked, revealing nothing but gray mist underneath. "You are a contagion," she hissed, her voice losing its melodic tone. "You carry the unwritten fire. It burns the preservation." Elias backed away, but the villagers were closing in, their graceful movements turning into a slow, predatory glide. He realized that this paradise was the most dangerous layer of all. In the ossuary, the forest tried to file you away. Here, it tried to absorb you into its static perfection. If he stayed, his will would be eroded by the hum, his memories smoothed over until he became just another marble citizen in a town that never saw a sunset. He ran toward the edge of the village, but the silver trees seemed to shift, the paths curving back toward the center of the square. The fountain, the one carved in his likeness, began to pour out not water, but the same obsidian ink he had seen in the deep root. The ink stained the white marble, and the humming of the villagers turned into a shrill, dissonant scream. "The archive is purging the error," the woman shouted, her face now a web of silver cracks. Elias clutched his chest, feeling the heartbeat of the silver compass, the one now part of his own pulse, accelerating. He needed a catalyst, something that didn't belong in this realm of perfect preservation. He reached into his mind, searching for a memory that was messy, painful, and raw. He thought of the scent of a storm-tossed sea, the bitter taste of a failed harvest, and the searing heat of a forge. He projected these thoughts outward through the runes. The violet light flared, clashing with the silver glow. Where the two lights met, the ground began to heave. The white stone of the square shattered, and real, dark, messy earth began to erupt from beneath the pristine surface. The villagers screamed as the imperfection touched them. They began to age in seconds, their marble skin wrinkling and turning to dust as the stolen time Eldermurk had held back finally claimed its due. "The silver layer is a lie," Elias roared, his voice cracking the sky. The ethereal light shattered like a glass dome. Beyond it, he saw the truth. The silver village was built atop a massive, calcified web of the same roots that fueled the ossuary. It was a farm. The beauty was just the bait to keep the souls complacent, while their essence was slowly drained to keep the higher forest alive. Elias didn't wait for the village to collapse. He dove into one of the fissures in the earth, following the scent of wet soil and decay. He was falling again, but this time, he wasn't being pulled by the king. He was being pushed by the sheer force of the reality he had reclaimed. He landed in a place of shifting colors and liquid logic, the Weeping Labyrinth. Here, the walls were made of frozen tears, and the only way to move forward was to navigate the regrets of the dead. As he stood up, he saw a figure waiting for him in the corridor of ice. It was the woman he had once loved, the memory he had lost in the spire. She looked at him with eyes full of 1,000 what-ifs. "You finally came back for me," she whispered, her hand trembling as she reached for him. Elias froze. This was the ultimate test of Eldermurk. It wasn't just taking his life, it was using his heart as a compass to lead him into a dead end. The woman before him, Sarah, was a vision of warmth in a realm of absolute frost. Her hair caught a phantom light that shouldn't have existed here, and the scent of wildflowers followed her, a cruel contrast to the sterile, metallic air of the Weeping Labyrinth. She looked exactly as she had the day Elias left the village to hunt for his first relic, hopeful, worried, and vibrantly alive. "Elias," she breathed, her voice a melody that almost drowned out the low, rhythmic thrumming of the runes on his arms. "The path is so long. You look so tired. Won't you just stop? We can stay here, in the quiet. The fog can't reach us in the center of the labyrinth." Elias felt the resolve in his chest falter. The violet light of the unwritten mark dimmed, the jagged runes cooling against his skin. This was the most refined poison Eldermurk had to offer. It didn't use obsidian spikes or iron crowns, it used the shape of his own longing. He looked at her hand, it was soft, warm, and inviting. But then he looked at the walls of the labyrinth. The frozen tears that formed the corridors weren't just ice. Inside each translucent block, a face was trapped in a perpetual sob. These were the souls who had succumbed to the labyrinth of regret. They had followed the ghosts of their past into these dead ends, choosing a beautiful lie over a harsh reality, until the labyrinth simply grew over them, preserving their sorrow in crystal. "You aren't Sarah," Elias said, his voice a rasping whisper. "Sarah is a grandmother now, or she's long since buried in the churchyard under the sun. You are just the echo of the man I used to be." The figure's expression shifted. The warmth in her eyes didn't vanish, it intensified, becoming a burning, desperate heat. "Does it matter if I am a memory? The world you want to go back to is gone, Elias. You've been in the mist for decades, though it felt like hours. Everyone you knew is dust. If you leave, you go back to nothing. If you stay, you have me. You have this moment, forever." Elias looked at his ink-stained hands. He knew she was likely right. Time in Eldermurk moved like a coiled spring, tight, distorted, and unpredictable. But the nothing of the real world, with its cold winters and certain deaths, was infinitely more precious than a forever built on the hunger of a Shadow King. "I'd rather die as a footnote in a real world than live as a masterpiece in a fake one," Elias growled. He raised his hand, and the violet runes flared with a blinding, discordant light. He didn't attack the figure. He reached into the wall of ice beside him. He grabbed the frozen grief of a stranger, pulling the raw emotion into himself. The labyrinth shrieked. It wasn't used to its prisoners taking more sorrow than they were given. The figure of Sarah began to distort. Her skin turned to gray parchment, her eyes melting into ink. She wasn't a woman anymore. She was a sentient script, a page of the Eldermurk archive trying to rewrite his ending. "You are a fool, Thorne," the script creature shrieked, its voice now a cacophony of 1,000 rejected souls. "The labyrinth has no exit for those who refuse to mourn." "Then I'll build one," Elias replied. He slammed his fist into the floor of the Weeping Labyrinth. The ink flowing through his veins acted as a solvent, melting the frozen tears into a dark, rushing river of liquid regret. The corridors began to collapse, the crystalline walls shattering into millions of shards that reflected his own determined face. The river swept him away. He wasn't swimming, he was being carried by the collective weight of every, if only, and I should have, that Eldermurk had ever harvested. It was a torrent of psychic energy that would have drowned a lesser mind, but Elias rode the current, using his spite as a rudder. As the labyrinth dissolved behind him, the river of tears poured into a gargantuan, mechanical heart. We were now at the very engine of the forest, the gearworks of the ghastly. Immense brass gears, hundreds of feet in diameter and caked in obsidian rust, ground together with a sound that mimicked a titan's heartbeat. This was what pumped the mist upward. This was the physical manifestation of the king's will. Between the gears, millions of tiny, glowing fibers, the stolen nerves of the lost, connected the machinery to the roots above. Elias pulled himself out of the dark water, standing on a catwalk made of cold, black iron. The vibration here was so intense it made his teeth ache. In the center of the gearworks, suspended by chains of frozen smoke, was a giant hourglass. But it didn't contain sand. It contained the glowing essence of the Silver Village, the ink of the ossuary, and the tears of the labyrinth. The mist wasn't just breath, it was process time. "Stop the clock, stop the forest," Elias muttered to himself. But as he moved toward the hourglass, a shadow detached itself from the grinding gears. It was tall, thin, and wore the tattered remnants of a relic hunter's coat. It carried a lantern that bled a black flame. "I wondered when I'd meet you," the shadow said. "I'm the one who came before you, and the one before him. We all make it to the gears, Elias. We all think we can break the machine." The shadow raised its lantern, and the black flame illuminated the catwalk. Dozens of other figures emerged from the steam and grease, failed versions of Elias Thorne, each one further along in their transformation into the mist. Some were almost entirely transparent, others were fused into the brass gears themselves, their screams adding to the mechanical roar. "You aren't the hero of this story," the shadow hunter hissed. "You're just the latest part being installed into the engine." The shadow lunged, the black flame of its lantern licking the air like a serpent's tongue. Elias met the strike with his ink-hardened arms, the violet runes clashing against the black fire in a shower of sparks that smelled of burnt ozone and ancient dust. The fight was a blur of motion and sound. Every time the shadow struck, Elias felt a piece of his own history being erased. A strike to his shoulder made him forget his first day as an apprentice. A strike to his chest took away the memory of his mother's voice. The shadow was literally flaying his identity to make room for the gears. But Elias had one advantage the others hadn't possessed. He had already accepted his own erasure. He didn't try to hold onto his memories. Instead, he channeled the nothingness of his future into his strikes. He became a void that the black flame couldn't burn. He grabbed the shadow hunter by the throat, his ink-stained fingers sinking into the spectral fabric. "If I'm a part," Elias roared over the sound of the grinding gears, "then I'm the one that jams the works." He didn't throw the shadow, he pulled it into himself. He absorbed the failure of those who came before him, taking on their weight, their sorrow, and their exhaustion. The runes on his skin grew so bright they turned white, the heat melting the iron catwalk beneath his feet. He lunged for the giant hourglass. The shadow hunters tried to stop him, their spectral hands tearing at his clothes, but he was a juggernaut of violet fire. He reached the glass, his hands glowing with the concentrated spite of 1,000 years of lost souls. "Eldermurk ends with me." He drove his fist into the center of the hourglass. The glass didn't just break, it detonated. The processed time, the lives, the tears, the memories, erupted in a silent, blinding shockwave that surged through the gearworks, reversing the motion of the colossal brass wheels. The obsidian rust flew off the gears like shrapnel. The iron chains snapped. The machine was dying. As the gearworks began to tear itself apart, the gravity of Eldermurk finally failed. Elias was flung upward, through the layers he had fought his way through, past the melting labyrinth, through the crumbling silver village, and beyond the shriveled roots of the ossuary. He was a spark of violet light flying through a dying storm. The ascent was not a physical climb, it was a violent extraction. Elias felt as though he were being pulled through a needle's eye, his consciousness expanding and contracting as he bypassed the shattering layers of the subterranean nightmare. The roar of the dying gearworks faded into a high-pitched, crystalline ringing. The violet fire of his runes acted as a protective shell, a pocket of defiance in a world that was rapidly dissolving into primal chaos. When the sensation of movement finally stopped, Elias found himself standing on a surface that felt like cold glass. He was no longer underground. He was above the canopy, standing atop the very mist he had sought to destroy. But the mist had changed. It was no longer a swirling gray soup. It had flattened into a vast, silver mirror that stretched to every horizon. Above him, the sky was a deep, bruised purple, devoid of stars or a moon. There was only a single colossal eye, a nebula of swirling obsidian and white light, staring down from the zenith. "The Great Witness," Elias whispered, the title coming to him from the runes still humming in his blood. This was the true face of Eldermurk. Not a king, not a library, but a cosmic observer that fed on the entropy of experience. The forest below was merely the mouth. This was the stomach. And he was standing on the precipice of its final digestion. As he walked across the mirrored mist, his reflection didn't follow his movements. Instead, it showed a version of him that was already dead, a skeleton wrapped in a tattered relic hunter's cloak. Every step he took left a crack in the silver surface, and from those cracks, the black ink began to bleed upward, staining the purity of the mirror. "You have broken the machine, but you have not silenced the hunger," a voice boomed, coming from the sky itself. It was a voice of absolute cold, the sound of ice shifting in the void between galaxies. A figure began to manifest from the silver floor. It didn't rise. It unfolded. It was a tall, regal entity draped in robes made of starlight and shadow. It wore no mask, yet its face was impossible to focus on, a shifting mosaic of everyone Elias had ever known, flickering 1,000 times a second. "The gearworks were merely a tether," the entity said, its movements as fluid as spilled mercury. "A way to slow the consumption so the flavor of the lives could be savored. By destroying them, you have only accelerated the end. The witness is hungry, Elias Thorne, and you have brought it the most exquisite meal of all, a soul that knows exactly what it is losing. The entity raised a hand, and the mirrored floor beneath Elias began to liquefy. He felt himself sinking, not into water, but into the collective consciousness of the witness. He saw the birth of Eldermurk, a fallen star that had crashed into the world eons ago, a sentient void that needed to understand the fullness of life by consuming it. I didn't break the machine to feed your god, Elias snarled, his boots disappearing into the silver liquid. I broke it to set the time free. Time cannot be free, the entity countered. It can only be spent or stolen. Look at what you've done. The entity gestured to the horizon. The silver mirror was beginning to evaporate, turning into a torrential rain of light. Millions of sparks, the souls and memories Elias had released from the hourglass, were flying upward, drawn toward the obsidian eye in the sky. He hadn't saved them, he had delivered them to the ultimate predator. Elias felt a wave of despair that nearly extinguished the violet glow of his runes. Had every struggle, every sacrifice, and every memory lost been for nothing? Was Eldermurk simply an inescapable trap with a more elaborate ceiling? But then, he noticed something. The sparks weren't just being consumed. As they hit the obsidian eye, they were leaving marks. Small, jagged scars of white light. The witness wasn't just eating, it was being changed by the nature of what it consumed. The spite, the grief, the messy reality of the lives Elias had unleashed were like poison to a god of static observation. The eye began to twitch. The bruised purple sky started to tear, revealing glimpses of a world that looked suspiciously like the one Elias had left behind so long ago. A world with a sun, with birds, and with the scent of rain on hot pavement. The unwritten mark, Elias realized, looking at his glowing arms. It wasn't a virus for the machine. It's a virus for the witness. He realized he had one last role to play. He wasn't the delivery boy for a catastrophe, and he wasn't the jam in the gears. He was the final ingredient. You want a soul that knows what it's losing? Elias shouted at the sky, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and triumph. Then take all of it. Take the pain of every relic I found. Take the memory of Sarah's smile and the way the wind feels on the verge. Take the hunger of a man who refuses to be a ghost. He didn't wait to be consumed. He lunged upward, defying the liquid silver that held his legs. He channeled every ounce of the ink in his veins, every spark of the violet fire, and the collective weight of the ossuary he still carried in his mind into a single, soaring leap. He struck the obsidian eye like a bolt of violet lightning. The contact was a deafening silence. For a moment, Elias was the witness. He saw the universe as a vast, cold library, and he felt the sudden, agonizing influx of heat, noise, and emotion. He felt the sting of 1,000 bee stings, the warmth of 1 billion suns, and the crushing weight of 1 trillion heartbreaks. The witness shrieked, a sound that shattered the silver mirror and collapsed the bruised sky. Elias felt himself being torn apart, his essence scattered across the stars. But he wasn't dissolving into nothing. He was becoming the medium. He was the ink being splashed across the sterile pages of the cosmic archive, ruining the perfection, and in doing so, making it real. The obsidian eye exploded. Elias was falling again. Not through layers, not through shadows, but through a clear, blue sky. The air was warm. It smelled of salt and ozone. Below him, he saw a coastline, not of silver trees or obsidian spires, but of jagged gray rocks and a churning white-capped sea. He hit the water with a force that knocked the last of the Eldermurk breath from his lungs. He sank into the cold, bracing salt, and for the first time in an eternity, he felt the simple, beautiful sting of physical pain. He breached the surface, gasping for air. The sun, a real, burning, magnificent sun, was low on the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and orange. He swam toward the shore, his muscles aching, his body feeling heavy and real. When he finally crawled onto the sand, he collapsed, his chest heaving. He looked at his arms. The violet runes were gone. The skin was scarred, tanned by a sun he hadn't seen in decades, and very, very human. But as he closed his eyes, he heard a sound from the tree line just beyond the beach. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. He opened his eyes. Standing at the edge of the forest was a young girl, no more than 7 years old. She held a silver compass in her hand. The needle wasn't pointing north. It was pointing at him. "You're the one from the stories," she said, her voice clear and untainted. "The man who went into the mist and never came back." Elias looked at the compass, then at the forest behind her. The trees were green, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible gray haze clinging to their roots. "How long?" Elias asked, his voice a hoarse croak. "My grandmother says the mist took the village 100 years ago," the girl replied. "But the mist is different now. It doesn't hunt us. It just remembers us." Elias stood up, his bones creaking. He had destroyed the witness, but Eldermurk was a part of the world now. A scar on the face of reality that would never fully heal. He looked at his hands, solid, shaking, and mortal. He hadn't ended the story. He had just turned the page. The girl's words hung in the air like the heavy scent of ozone before a storm. 100 years. Elias looked at his hands, which felt both alien and intimately familiar. He had fought through the gears of a cosmic machine, shattered a god of observation, and yet the world he returned to was not the one he had left. It was a world that had moved on, leaving him as a living relic, a footnote that had survived the burning of the library. "The mist, it doesn't hunt?" Elias asked, stepping closer to the tree line. His boots sank into the damp sand, a sensation so mundane it felt miraculous. The girl shook her head, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and ancient caution. "It just stays at the edges. Sometimes, at night, we see lights in the deep wood. My grandmother says it's the forest dreaming of the people it used to know. But she says we must never go in. The trees have long memories, and they don't like to be woken up." She held out the silver compass. The needle was no longer spinning in a frantic dance of death. It hummed with a soft, steady violet glow, pointing directly at Elias's heart. He realized then that the unwritten mark wasn't gone, it had simply moved. It was no longer etched into his skin, it was etched into the world itself. He was the anchor now. "Give me the compass, child," Elias said softly. "It's not a toy for the living." As his fingers brushed the silver casing, a jolt of static electricity snapped between them. The girl let go, and the compass didn't fall. It hovered in the palm of his hand, its needle pulsing in time with his own heartbeat. The moment he gripped it, the gray haze at the roots of the trees began to stir. It didn't rush toward him in hunger, it bowed. The mist was no longer a predator, it was a servant without a master, and it recognized the man who had broken its chains. Elias turned away from the sea and looked toward the village beyond the dunes. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of a distant bell, a normal iron bell, rang out for the evening prayer. It was a life he had once craved, a life of simple beginnings and certain endings. But as he looked at the compass, he knew he couldn't enter that world. He was too saturated with the ink of the void. To walk among them would be to bring the shadow into their sunlight. Go home, Elias told the girl. Tell your grandmother that the hunter has returned, but the hunt is over. Tell her the mist is just a mirror now. If they don't look into it with fear, it won't show them monsters. The girl nodded and ran toward the village, her small footsteps leaving a trail that the wind already began to erase. Elias stood alone at the threshold of the Blackwood Verge. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world in a state of silver twilight, a shade that felt far too much like the layers he had escaped. He stepped into the forest. The transition was subtle. The temperature didn't drop, and the light didn't fail, but the sounds of the sea and the village were instantly replaced by a deep, resonant hum. The trees here were green, but their bark was etched with the same runes that had once marked his arms. Every leaf seemed to vibrate with a secret. He wasn't looking for a throne this time. He was looking for the wounds he had left behind. As he ventured deeper, he found the place where the obsidian spire had once pierced the sky. The spire was gone, but in its place was a massive, circular depression in the earth, filled with a liquid that looked like liquid starlight. This was the scar he had felt. The explosion of the witness had left a breach in the fabric of Eldermurk, a place where the archive was still leaking into reality. Standing at the edge of the starlight pool was the chronicler. The figure was smaller now, its parchment robes tattered and stained with the violet ink of Elias's defiance. The stag mask was cracked, revealing a single human eye that stared with a weary, ancient intelligence. It no longer held a staff, it held a simple wooden pen. "You came back," the chronicler said, its voice no longer a thunderous boom, but a dry whisper. "I told you the library wouldn't burn for a single page, but I didn't realize the page would rewrite the librarian." "The witness is dead," Elias said, clutching the compass. "The hunger is gone." "The hunger is never gone, Thorne. It has just changed its diet," the chronicler replied, gesturing to the pool of starlight. "Before, we collected to consume. Now, we collect to remember. But a memory without an observer is just a ghost. The archive needs a heart to beat for it. It needs someone to walk the layers and ensure the stories don't fade into the gray." The chronicler held out the pen. "The role of the king is vacant, but the role of the shepherd is open. You destroyed the cage, Elias. Now you must decide if you will let the inhabitants wander into the void, or if you will give them a home in the new Eldermurk." Elias looked into the pool. He saw the faces of the lost, the woman from the 14th century, the soldier, the children. They weren't screaming anymore. They were drifting in the starlight, peaceful but directionless. They were the unwritten now, waiting for a hand to guide their narrative. He looked back toward the village, where the first stars were beginning to appear in a real sky. He thought of the girl and her grandmother. He thought of Sarah, whose memory was now a part of the starlight rather than a frozen tear in a labyrinth. He understood the cost. To save them, he had to remain the footnote. He had to be the man who stayed in the mist so that others could live in the light. Elias reached out and took the pen. The moment his fingers closed around the wood, the pool of starlight erupted upward, forming a new structure. It wasn't an obsidian spire, it was a lighthouse made of white bone and violet flame. The light it cast didn't create shadows, it revealed truths. The chronicler bowed low, its parchment robes dissolving into the air. "The library is open, shepherd." "Right well." Elias Thorne stepped into the base of the lighthouse. He felt the weight of the 100 years he had missed, the weight of the millions of lives he now guarded, and the weight of the silence that would be his only companion. But as he looked at the first page of the new ledger, he didn't feel despair. He felt a grim, enduring purpose. He dipped the pen into the ink of his own history and began to write. "The mists of Eldermurk do not merely breathe. he wrote, his voice echoing through every layer of the forest. They remember. And as long as I draw breath, no story will ever truly be lost. Outside, the mist began to glow with a soft, protective light. The villagers looked toward the woods and, for the first time in a century, they didn't bar their doors. They saw the violet beam of the lighthouse cutting through the dark, and they knew that the guardian was awake. The ink flowed from the wooden pen as if it were drawn from Elias's own marrow. Each stroke on the parchment didn't just record a life, it anchored a soul. Inside the lighthouse of bone, time had lost its jagged edges. The walls, white and smooth as a polished skull, thrummed with the collective pulse of the new Eldermurk. Elias stood at the high desk, his eyes reflecting the violet flame that burned in the lantern above. He was no longer a man of flesh and bone, he was the living index of a realm reborn. But the piece was of fragile glass. Beyond the reach of the lighthouse's beam, at the very fringes of the silver trees, a new phenomenon was occurring. The mist, now stripped of its predatory hunger, was beginning to crystallize. It was as if the memories Elias was protecting were becoming too heavy for the air to hold. In the dark hollows where the light of the bonfire couldn't reach, shards of static were forming, jagged outcrops of frozen moments that refused to be integrated into the new ledger. Elias set the pen down, his fingers stiff. He could feel a disturbance in the resonance. It felt like a heartbeat that was out of sync with his own. He looked at the silver compass resting on the desk. The needle was vibrating so violently it threatened to shatter its glass casing. It wasn't pointing toward a person or a relic, it was pointing downward, into the foundation of the lighthouse itself. "The debt is never fully paid," a voice whispered. It wasn't the chronicler, nor was it the witness. It was a chorus of the voices he had absorbed in the gearworks. The failed hunters, the broken seekers. The shepherd guards the sheep, but who guards the shepherd from the wolf within? Elias realized that by absorbing the essence of those who came before him, he had also brought their collective trauma into the sanctuary. The unwritten mark had saved him, but it had also made him a vessel for every unfinished story Eldermurk had ever attempted to tell. The static at the edges of the forest was a manifestation of their unresolved grief, a psychic rot that was beginning to eat away at the borders of his new kingdom. He left the safety of the lighthouse and ventured back into the woods. The silver trees were weeping, not tears of ice or ink, but a thick, translucent nectar that glowed with the memories of things that had never happened, the might-have-beens that the silver village had once cultivated. This was the most dangerous form of corruption. It was the temptation of the false future. As he walked, the ground beneath his feet began to shift. The earth turned into a mosaic of mirrors, reflecting not his face, but the faces of the men he had absorbed. He saw their families, their homes, their final moments of terror. The weight of it was immense, a physical pressure that threatened to buckle his knees. "You cannot carry all of us, Elias," the reflections hissed. "The ledger is too full. The ink is running dry. Let the static take us. Let the forest return to the gray." Elias clutched the silver compass, using its violet pulse to steady his mind. "I promised no story would be lost. That includes the ones that ended in the dark." He reached the edge of a deep ravine that hadn't been there a day ago. At the bottom, the static was thickest. It looked like a forest made of broken glass, a labyrinth of razor-sharp memories that shrieked when the wind touched them. In the center of the ravine stood a figure that mirrored his own. It was a man made of violet flame and obsidian ink, wearing the tattered cloak of a relic hunter. It was the ghost of the hunter, the part of Elias that still wanted to find, to take, and to leave. "You think you've changed the world?" the ghost asked, its voice a perfect replica of Elias's own from the night he entered the spire. "You've just built a prettier cage. You're still standing in the mist, Thorne. You're still a prisoner of your own curiosity. The ghost raised a hand, and the shards of static flew toward Elias like a storm of knives. He didn't raise a shield. He didn't fight back with the power of the shepherd. He stood still, letting the shards pierce his translucent skin. He didn't feel pain. He felt information. Each shard was a question. Why me? Why was I taken? What was the point of my struggle? Elias realized that the static wasn't an enemy to be defeated, it was a cry for acknowledgement. The failed hunters didn't want to be guarded, they wanted to be understood. They didn't want a lighthouse, they wanted a witness. He stepped into the ravine, descending into the glass forest. The static tore at his robes, his skin, and his mind. He reached the ghost and, instead of striking it, he embraced it. He pulled the spirit of the hunter, and all the hunters before him, into the core of his being. The explosion was silent. The glass forest shattered, and the static dissolved into a soft, gray rain that soaked into the earth. The ravine closed, the silver trees straightened, and the resonance of the forest returned to a harmonious, steady hum. Elias stood in the center of the clearing, his form now shimmering with a complex, iridescent light. He was no longer just the shepherd, he was the archive itself. He had accepted the chaos within the order, the shadow within the light. He returned to the lighthouse, his steps heavy with the wisdom of 1,000 lives. He picked up the pen and began a new chapter. He didn't write about the heroes or the kings. He wrote about the hunters who failed. He wrote about the people who got lost in the fog and the ones who never found what they were looking for. He gave them a place in the ledger. He gave them a purpose in the memory. As he wrote, the violet flame in the lantern above grew brighter, casting its light further than ever before. The borders of Eldermurk expanded, not to consume more of the world, but to offer a deeper sanctuary for those who were already within. Elias Thorne, the shepherd of the mist, looked out from the high window. The sun was rising on the world beyond the dunes, a world that would never know his name. And that was enough. He was the secret that kept the world's memories safe. He was the footnote that ensured the story never truly ended. But deep in the foundations of the lighthouse, in a place where even his light didn't fully reach, a single silver compass began to spin. And it wasn't pointing at a heart. It was pointing toward a horizon that didn't exist yet. The spinning needle of the basement compass was not a malfunction, it was a warning. Elias felt the vibration in the soles of his boots, a frantic, high-pitched frequency that spoke of a threat coming from the one place he had neglected, the world of the living. While Eldermurk had been reforming itself into a sanctuary of memory, the world outside the dunes had grown cold and desperate. 100 years of normal history had passed, but the absence of the mist's gravity had left a vacuum. Scientific curiosity had turned into a hungry, industrial greed. In the cities beyond the sea, men who played with lightning and steam had heard the legends of the White Lighthouse and the Fountain of Time. They didn't want a shepherd, they wanted an engine. Elias stood at the gallery of his lighthouse, watching the horizon. The sunrise he had admired was now obscured by a thick, oily smoke. Ships, massive, ironclad beasts of coal and fire, were approaching the coastline. They weren't coming for relics, they were coming to harvest the very essence of the mist. They saw the starlight pool not as a sacred memory, but as a fuel source. They are coming to unwrite what you have written, the voices in his head whispered. The failed hunters, now part of his collective consciousness, trembled. They knew the smell of iron and ambition all too well. Elias descended the bone stairs. He could feel the forest reacting. The silver trees were retracting their leaves, and the ground was hardening into obsidian. Eldermurk was preparing to defend itself, but it was doing so in its old, predatory way. If he allowed the forest to fight back with its ancient hunger, the cycle of nightmare would begin all over again. The sanctuary would become a slaughterhouse. "I will not let you become the monster to fight the man," Elias told the trees. He walked out onto the beach, the silver compass in his hand glowing with an intense, pulsing violet light. The first ironclad ship dropped its anchor with a thunderous splash that sent a shockwave through the water. A group of men in heavy, brass-trimmed diving suits and military coats stepped onto the sand. They carried strange devices, glass canisters connected to humming vacuum pumps and brass rods tipped with artificial magnets. The leader of the expedition, a man with a face scarred by chemical burns and eyes that saw the world as a series of equations, stepped forward. He didn't look at the beauty of the lighthouse. He looked at the violet runes that had begun to glow on the beach. "You must be the guardian," the man said, his voice amplified by a brass horn. "My name is Director Vane. We represent the Coalition of Progress. We've come for the Starlight Pool. Your forest is an inefficiency in the global energy market, and we are here to rectify it." "This is not a fuel source," Elias said, his voice echoing with the weight of 1,000 years. "This is the memory of the world. To take it is to erase yourselves." Vane laughed, a dry sound that was quickly swallowed by the hiss of steam from his ship. "We've outgrown memories, old man. We live in the age of the future. Now, step aside, or we will see how your mystical fog stands up to concentrated heat and pressured steel." Vane gave a signal, and the machines hummed to life. The brass rods began to glow with a sickly, artificial yellow light. They weren't trying to enter the mist, they were trying to tear it apart at the molecular level. The air began to crackle. The silver trees at the edge of the forest shrieked as their essence was forcibly sucked into the glass canisters. Elias felt the pain in his own chest. Every tree they harvested was a chapter of the ledger being ripped out. The starlight pool began to churn, its light flickering. "Stop!" Elias roared. He didn't use the ink, he used the void. He struck the ground with his staff, and a wave of violet energy surged across the sand, short-circuiting the brass rods and sending the men stumbling back. But Vane was prepared. Counter-resonant frequencies, now. The ship's massive horn emitted a sound so discordant it felt like a needle being driven into the brain. It was a frequency designed to cancel out the heartbeat of Eldermurk. Elias fell to his knees, his vision blurring. The violet light of his compass faded to a dull gray. The machine started up again, faster this time. The glass canisters began to fill with a swirling, trapped violet light, the stolen souls of the new Eldermurk. "You are stealing their peace." Elias choked out, his body feeling like it was being dissolved by the artificial sound. "We are giving them a purpose," Vane replied. "They will power our cities. They will light our streets. They will finally be useful." As Elias watched his sanctuary being pillaged, a cold, dark realization took hold. He had tried to be a shepherd of light, but Eldermurk was born of a fallen star and a cosmic void. To save the memories, he couldn't just guard them. He had to remind the world why the mist was feared in the first place. He reached into the very bottom of the ledger, to the part he had written about the failed hunters and the obsidian rot. He didn't just read the words, he invited the rot back into his veins. "The archive is no longer a library," Elias declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the realm. "It is a conversation." He shattered the lantern. The violet flame didn't fall. It exploded outward in a million tiny sparks, each one carrying a fragment of the ledger. They didn't fly into a cosmic eye. They flew into the trees, into the iron wrecks, into the dunes, and most importantly, into the village. The mist began to thin. It didn't disappear, but it became translucent, a soft veil that draped itself over reality. The silver trees didn't vanish, but they began to grow real fruit, fruit that tasted of memories and dreams. Elias felt himself fading. His physical form, which had been held together by the gravity of the archive, was beginning to dissolve into the same soft light. He wasn't dying, he was becoming the atmosphere. The lighthouse of bone began to sink back into the earth, transforming into a massive, white-barked oak tree that stood as a permanent monument at the center of the wood. The obsidian wrought turned into rich, black soil. As Elias's consciousness expanded, he felt the villagers waking up. They didn't feel terror. They felt a sudden sharp memory of a grandmother's hug, a soldier's bravery, or a child's laughter. They felt the weight of the past, but it wasn't a burden, it was an anchor that gave their progress a soul. He saw Director Vane, still trapped in the labyrinth, but the walls were no longer ice. They were glass, and Vane was looking at his own reflection, not with greed, but with the first stirrings of regret. The labyrinth wasn't a prison anymore, it was a school. Elias Thorne, the man who was a relic hunter, a king, a prisoner, and a shepherd, finally let go of the pen. He was the mist now. He was the rust on the iron ships. He was the whisper in the trees. He was Eldermurk, and Eldermurk was finally, truly alive. The transformation of the archive into a living breath was not the end, but a deep, resonant transition. Eldermurk had shifted from a static prison of the past into a shimmering, fluid reality. Here is part 12, the beginning of the two-part finale. The white-barked oak that was once the lighthouse of bone stood as the silent sentinel of a new era. Its roots reached deep into the bedrock of the world, drinking from the starlight pool that had now stabilized into a mirror-like lake. The mist no longer clung to the ground in thick, suffocating layers. Instead, it drifted like the smoke of a guttering candle, catching the light of the sun and turning the blackwood verge into a realm of perpetual dawn. Elias Thorne existed now as a ripple in the atmosphere. He was the warmth in the silver leaves and the rhythmic pulse in the soil. But as the shepherd of the wind, he realized that his work was not merely to watch the memories drift. He had to prepare the world for the final reconciliation, the moment where the shadow of Eldermurk and the light of humanity would finally merge into a single, cohesive truth. In the village beyond the dunes, the change was profound. People no longer spoke of the cursed woods with trembling lips. Instead, they told stories. They sat by their hearths and recounted the lives of those who had been lost, and as they spoke, the mist would seep through the cracks of their doors, forming faint, glowing outlines of the people they remembered. A mother could see the flicker of her son's smile in the steam of her tea. A husband could feel the phantom touch of his wife's hand in the evening breeze. Elias watched this through 1,000 eyes. He saw that by releasing the archive, he had given the world its soul back. But there was one final shadow that refused to dissipate, a knot of darkness at the center of the ironclad wrecks on the shore. Director Vane had not been released by the softening of the mist. His greed and his cold, mechanical logic had acted as an anchor for the old obsidian rot. He had become a hollow vessel, a negative shepherd, who was gathering the lingering fragments of the static to build a new throne of his own. While Elias was the wind, Vane was the vacuum, trying to suck the beauty back into a dark, industrial void. Elias knew that he could not fight Vane with violence. To strike at him would be to return to the persona of the wolf, and that would only feed the darkness. He needed a bridge, a way to reach the man inside the machine without destroying the world they both inhabited. He reached out to the girl he had met on the beach, the one with the silver compass. She was older now, a young woman with eyes that had seen the transition of an age. She sat by the starlight pool, the compass resting in her lap. It was no longer pointing at Elias. It was spinning slowly, humming a melody that only those who truly listened could hear. "Go to the wrecks," Elias whispered through the rustling of the leaves. "Take the compass. It is not a weapon and it is not a tool. It is a mirror. Show him what he has forgotten." The girl stood up, her face resolute. She walked past the silver trees and across the dunes toward the graveyard of iron. The air there was cold, smelling of coal and stagnant water. As she approached the largest ship, a black, oily mist began to rise from the deck, taking the shape of jagged thorns and weeping eyes. "You should not be here, child of the light." A voice boomed from the iron hull, a voice that was Vane's, but distorted by the echoes of the old witness. "This place is for the future. This place is for the power that your memories are too weak to hold." The girl didn't falter. She stepped onto the rusted deck, the silver compass glowing with a soft, steady violet light. "I didn't come for power," she said, her voice clear and unafraid. "I came to show you the story you stopped writing." She held up the compass. The violet light didn't push back the black mist, it illuminated it. Inside the obsidian thorns, she showed Vane the memory of his own childhood, a boy who loved the stars not for their energy, but for their mystery. She showed him the moment his curiosity had turned into a hunger for control, and the pain of the man who had traded his heart for a machine. The black mist shrieked, but the girl held her ground. Elias, channeling the collective grace of every soul in the archive, poured his essence into the compass. The violet light expanded, turning the iron wreck into a cathedral of translucent glass. Vane emerged from the shadows, his face no longer scarred by fire, but by tears. He looked at the compass, then at the girl, and finally at the silver forest beyond the shore. The vacuum in his chest began to fill, not with coal or steam, but with the simple crushing weight of being human again. "It's so heavy," Vane whispered, his knees buckling. "It's supposed to be," the girl replied, reaching out to catch him. As the two of them stood on the deck of the dying ship, the final knot of obsidian wrought dissolved. The iron wrecks didn't vanish, but they were instantly covered in a thick carpet of moss and wildflowers. They became a part of the landscape, a reminder of a war that ended not with a bang, but with a realization. Elias felt the final tension in the world snap. The archive was no longer a separate realm. It was woven into the very fabric of existence. He felt his consciousness beginning to settle, to find a permanent home in the rhythm of the tides and the growth of the trees. But there was one more thing he had to do before the story could truly find its peace. He had to prepare the final chapter, the one that would ensure that even when he was gone, the mists of Eldermurk would always be there to remind the world that some things are too beautiful to be explained. The white oak, the former heart of the lighthouse of bone, now reached so high that its topmost silver leaves brushed against the edge of the sky. Beneath its sprawling canopy, the starlight lake remained perfectly still, reflecting a world that had finally learned to live with its own ghosts. The distinction between the living and the remembered had blurred into a beautiful, seamless tapestry. Elias Thorne felt his final threads of individual consciousness fraying. He was no longer a man standing in a forest. He was the forest itself. He was the salt on the young girl's skin, the rust on the moss-covered ships, and the violet pulse that still beat deep within the earth. He had achieved the impossible. He had turned a cosmic trap into a sanctuary. In his final moments of clarity, Elias looked toward the village one last time. He saw the girl, now the keeper of the compass, teaching a new generation that the dark is not something to be conquered, but something to be understood. He saw that the progress of man had not stopped, but it had slowed, gaining a reverence for the mysteries that lay beyond the reach of the gear and the vacuum. Elias let out a final, long-held breath. As he did, a soft, violet mist surged from the roots of the great oak, sweeping across the beach, over the dunes, and through the streets of every town in the world. It didn't take anything. It gave. It left a faint, shimmering residue on every doorway and every heart, a permanent reminder that the story is never truly over, and that even the smallest footnote can change the meaning of the entire book. The mists of Eldermurk had finally found their purpose. They were the world's memory, the world's conscience, and the world's wonder. And in the center of that mist, if you listen very closely on a night when the moon is hidden behind the gray, you can still hear the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of a wooden pen against a bone-white desk, writing the next chapter of a tale that has no end. The Eldermurk call to action. The fog is thickening once more, traveler, but do not fear the dark. You have walked the layers of the abyss and returned with the light of the archive in your eyes. If these echoes of Eldermurk have stirred the shadows within your own soul, then you are already part of the ledger. Subscribe to our circle of seekers, and let the violet flame guide you through the mysteries yet to be told. Like this chronicle to anchor your own memory in the shifting mists, and comment below with the name of the shadow you carry. For in Eldermurk, no story is ever truly lost as long as there is someone to hear it. The gate is closing, but the whisper remains. Will you be the one to answer the next time the mist calls?